The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Ed Crooks joined Wood Mackenzie in 2019. Based in New York, he covers the full range of commodities, technologies, and sectors, with a particular focus on climate policy, economics, and the energy transition. He writes Wood Mackenzie's popular Energy Pulse newsletter, analyzing the latest developments in the world of energy, and also hosts the Energy Gang podcast, one of the world's most popular energy-focused podcasts. Now let's get into the episode with Ed. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you, Lysandra. Nice to be back again with our excellent guest coming on, Ed.
Yes, today we're welcoming back Ed Crooks, Vice Chair Americas at Wood Mackenzie and host of the Energy Gang podcast. Welcome back, Ed.
Well, thanks very much indeed. Great to be on again.
Ed, it's my pleasure to kick this off. And for this episode, it's about insights from industry experts and personal experience. So let me kick this off. And it's a long question. Since joining Wood Mackenzie in 2019, you've had a chance to cover a full range of energy sectors and technologies. How has this broad focus, especially on climate policy and energy transition, shaped your understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing the industry, the energy industry itself?
Well, it's been obviously a fascinating time to be looking at this industry. I don't know if you know, but what I did before, I was also covering energy very closely at the Financial Times. I was for a long time energy editor at the Financial Times newspaper, and then jumped, as you say, to Wood Mackenzie in 2019. And I joined, about 6 months before the pandemic hit. So kind of went through that, enormous upheaval, very kind of traumatic change, oil prices being negative. I went on a few podcasts, other people's podcasts, talking about negative oil prices and
negative $40.
Well, that happened exactly.
Yes.
That absolutely wild time in April of 2020. Then the recovery out that we had, and oil and gas prices surging. Then, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and everything that's followed that. And so it's been a very turbulent and eventful time. It's also been a time when we have seen climate policy kind of wax and wane, I think, pretty significantly. And that's one of the key sort of takeaways. When I look back on my time, 4 years, a little bit over 4 years that I've been at Wood Mackenzie, we had a tremendous kind of wave of enthusiasm in essentially implementing the Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement signed in 2015, and countries of the world were pretty united in thinking that they were going to take concrete action to implement that. And that reached probably a high point around COP26 at Glasgow in 2021. If you think of things in particular, like the commitments in the financial sector, which have been hugely important, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero and so on, that was a very significant development. And since then, it feels like there's been an ebbing away from that in lots of ways. Other priorities for energy policy have risen up the agenda. Energy security has very much risen to the fore because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fallout from that. Energy affordability has also very much risen up the political agenda for energy because of the surge in prices that we saw coming out of the pandemic. And so you have all these other objectives competing with the climate issue as pressures now that are on policymakers and on the industry. And the other thing that's going on is that we are really bumping up against some of the technical challenges and constraints in the transition. When you think about things like what's happening in the hydrogen industry, an enormous amount of excitement over the potential of low carbon hydrogen to play all kinds of roles in the energy system. When you actually start running pilots, trying things out, actually starting to build plants and so on, turns out it's difficult, possibly more difficult than you'd thought, very likely more expensive than you'd thought. The economics look significantly worse than they did a couple of years ago and are not getting better at the moment. Think about another example. Think about renewable energy and what's been happening in Europe just recently with the notorious Dunkelflaute. You know about the Dunkelflaute, but the dark doldrums, Dunkelflatter as they call it in German. It's been overcast, so you're not getting much from solar power. It's been very still. You've not had much from wind power. That's caused real problems for the grid in Germany. In particular, wholesale electricity prices have rocketed. So, as I say, all these kind of various challenges are coming to the fore, I think. It's making people realize that achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement is going to be really difficult. In fact, certainly getting to net zero by mid-century looks impossible now. That looks out of reach. People aren't formally admitting that, but if you're being honest, it looks like we're not going to get there. And so I think we're having a bit of a reset of expectations, bit of a recalibration is going to be necessary in terms of what people think is realistic about what we can achieve, and also then what the consequences of the path we're on are going to be for the climate and for the impacts of climate change. And I don't want to suggest it's all terrible news. Over the past 4 years is the rise of China as a low-carbon energy superpower, and that's massive. We can get into that in a moment if you want. So it's absolutely not the case that there's been no progress, but still I think people are having a bit of a reality check right now, bit of a reset, bit of a reassessment of their expectations. And I think it's going to be important for us all to digest the implications of that pretty quickly so that we can work out what are the best routes forward.
Yeah, it's a really good summary of what's happening. I mean, you talked about hydrogen. We can talk about carbon capture and storage. That takes 7 years to get underway, like to get it built. We can talk about small modular reactors, which looks very promising. At least there's a lot of talk about that here in Canada because we're in Ontario specifically very nuclear oriented, but that's going to take time too. So I think you've summarized the challenges that we have, yet we're also challenged with time because I don't know if as you said, we're probably not going to meet that target. In fact, right now we're currently 1.6 degrees above this year. So we've got some heavy work to do. So, and no pressure, our podcast has to change the world. Yeah, I think it's a great summary that you have, and it is a reset, and we got to figure out how to do it and do it well. And the other thing I think is a really good point, because we're having a discussion, we're doing a white paper. China is they are the superpower, and they're taking market share in business. So that's something that typically North Americans pretty competitive. We don't like people taking our market share, so we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, and the other thing is that I think people have really had a dramatic reassessment of the position of China over the past year, in the sense that China is not the kind of the low-cost, low-quality, less advanced technology supplier anymore. In many low-carbon energy technologies, China is right at the cutting edge, and actually its technology is superior. Certainly this is true in batteries, and this has been one of the things which has been really... we've heard stories about European governments trying to demand that China transfer technology to them if they want to sell in the European market.
Yes.
I think even 5 years ago, if you'd said to people, by 2024, will Europe be lagging so far behind China in battery technology that it's desperate to get hold of Chinese technology? People would not have believed you, but that is where we are now. If you look at BYD now, Build Your Dreams,
yes,
the biggest electric vehicle manufacturer in the world, growing by leaps and bounds in global markets. Some of the other Chinese EV manufacturers also coming up very fast as well. Tesla facing really severe challenges again. You might think Tesla kind of bestrides the world of electric vehicles like a colossus. Well, yes, but it is facing really serious challenges, and the challenges are not coming from Detroit, they're coming from the traditional US auto industry, not coming from BMW and Porsche, they're coming from BYD, other Chinese companies. And that is, I think, a real... That's something people really have to kind of get their heads around. There's a real mental adjustment required for people to understand that now, as China's not just about low-cost, low-quality volume production. China's about cutting-edge technology.
And staying with this, because we do work in the automotive sector, certainly you're talking about 90 million cars being manufactured. China now manufacturing 30 million of them. And now North American automotive manufacturers will they even make it in the next 5 or 10 years because of this transition? So that has a huge impact on jobs, our economic system, things of that nature. So we are challenged, and we've got in this whole piece going forward for sure.
And it is, one of the things I think about this is it's a bit like that whole innovator's dilemma argument, that at a time of disruptive change, it can be really an asset to not have any strength in the old incumbent technology.
Yes.
China obviously had a large internal combustion engine vehicle industry. It did sell around the world, but those vehicles were not really fantastically good, and they were certainly not super competitive in world markets. And so to be able to essentially leapfrog that business and go straight to EVs has been a huge strength for them. And these brand new companies that are springing up, rather as it was with Tesla, right? Where you think about Tesla, you might have thought, how can this plucky little startup compete against the behemoths of Ford and GM? Well, they can do it pretty well, actually. In fact, because they don't have that legacy of an incumbent manufacturing process, technology, everything that they have to look after, it's easier for them. And China, I think, on a national scale is very similar. And that's a real challenge to Europe and the United States, North America in general. And it's one of the things where it seems like the answer, in the US at least, is going to be to put up a wall around the US and try and ring fence that market. And if you look at the proposals for very high tariffs under the Biden administration to get keeping out Chinese EVs, I'm sure they're going to be even higher under the Trump administration. And clearly, as you know, President-elect Trump is the world's biggest fan of tariffs. And so I'm sure those barriers will be there to make sure that those Chinese companies don't manage to sell into the US. But the rest of the world is going to kind of carry on regardless. I had a very interesting conversation. I have a couple of colleagues who are Jordanian, originally from Jordan. And they were saying when they go back home to Jordan, great bulk of the taxis and the Ubers there are now electric, BYD, some Volkswagen as well. Jordan is a country, despite being in the Middle East, doesn't really have any oil production of its own, doesn't have a big incumbent car industry that it wants to protect. Just absolutely makes sense for Jordanian cab drivers to buy these, and the Chinese ones are the best value offerings on the market. You can get a BYD in many markets now for less than $20,000 for a decent four-door car. A lot of places, particularly other countries that don't produce their own oil, very often if you're not an oil-producing country, importing oil is your number one use of foreign currency.
Yep.
And the extent to which you can get rid of that, save that money, maybe install solar panels, again, cheap, very cheap, very cheap solar panels available, put them on every rooftop, charge your EV that way, cut your oil import bill. It's a very, very compelling offering. And it's nothing to do with climate.
It's economic driven.
It's it's totally economically driven. And I think that's going to be a very powerful force.
With your work as host of the Energy Gang, you have access to leading experts in climate policy, economics, and energy technology. What are some of the most valuable insights you've gained from your guests that have deepened your perspective on the energy transition?
I think it's been really interesting just being at COP29, as I was in November, and talking to a lot of people there about global climate policy and the way that it's evolving. And also we focused a lot, because this was, of course, just in the aftermath of the US election results, so a lot of discussion about kind of US policy and what that's going to be like going forward. I mean, just as a digression, this isn't really an insight of anybody else's, but this was just sort of an impression I had. Have you ever been to a COP? Either of you, Dave and Lysandra?
I personally have not, no.
I mean, even just one time, I'd very highly recommend it, because like a lot of these things, you can read about it and you watch the videos and you listen to the podcasts and everything, and you can have a kind of an intellectual understanding of it. You understand it in your head, but you kind of, if you go and you're physically there in person, you understand it in your guts, right? It's a kind of that sort of instinctive feel for it. So I've been to 3 now. That was my 3rd. The thing that always strikes me when you walk in the halls is just how diverse the world is. A lot of people come in international dress, and so you're people in Arab dress and African dress, and there are indigenous Americans with feathers in their hair, and all kinds of different styles and cultures represented. It makes you realize the world is a very diverse place with so many different political systems, cultural attitudes, modes of social organization. People have very different resource endowments. People have very different economies. A huge range of people. To me, it's kind of amazing that anyone ever comes up with any kind of agreement at all. It's actually quite impressive, I think. It's kind of inspiring that the world ever agrees on anything, and so people will often be quite kind of negative about climate policy and the UN process. No, it hasn't. Why have we not solved this problem? It shows that it's all a waste of time there. To which I say, one thing I think is it's amazing we've done anything. And 2, I think it is definitely the case that things have been achieved. And if you think about the trajectory that we're on, let's say in 2000 or the end of the 90s in the immediate aftermath of the Kyoto Agreement, the Kyoto Agreement is generally written off as a massive flop. But you think about what we've had in terms of the development of low carbon energy industries, in particular of renewables, since then, which has just kind of exploded, and the costs of plunge, cost of solar power dropped 90% plus 95% over that period. So we're in a very different world now than we were then. And a lot of that is because of actually the impetus, the push that the UN process, as implemented by governments around the world, gave to clean energy. That has been a huge benefit, I think, to the world. And even if we're not going to hit the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is going to be increasingly difficult, we have still made a lot of progress. So that's one thing I think. Another thing I think is at COP29 specifically, a lot of the things I was talking about in terms of the challenges facing the transition were very kind of starkly exposed. Still, there's big differences of opinion. The meeting was intended to agree a global deal on climate finance because essentially the meeting was intended to agree a global deal on climate finance. And one of the reasons that's important is because that was being very clearly linked to emissions reductions. So what we have coming up now at the end of 2025 is COP30 in Brazil. And the goal for that is to get all the countries of the world to agree to more ambitious goals, what they call the nationally determined contributions for cutting emissions. And the whole kind of mood around COP29 was that's going to be really, really hard, not least because of the other big thing that I've been talking to people about a lot recently, which is change of administration in the US, shift from an administration that is quite focused on climate change to one that very explicitly in a kind of declared and stated way does not believe in the UN process to address climate change, is going to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement. As we speak, similar pressures in some European countries, other parts of the world as well. So you put all that together, I think the mood is certainly quite downbeat about policy driving decarbonisation of the world economy. The insight that I was getting from a lot of people that I spoke to was that the transition, as it continues to proceed, is going to have to be economically driven. It's going to be less policy driven. It's going to be driven by businesses and by consumers and by investors. And then that relies on the low carbon technologies being the more compelling and more competitive options. And so it's the cheap Chinese solar panels, it's the cheap EVs. It's other examples where businesses can invest in low carbon knowing that it will provide an economic payback for them. And it's not just to do with some kind of sustainability goal or whatever. But one thing we might want to get into is the question of sort of AI and energy and the implications there, because in terms of kind of what continues to drive the transition, I think that's something that's going to be very important, and that's something that I've been also talking to people about quite a bit.
Okay, well, I'm going to get into that, Ed, because that's a topic that I really quite enjoy too. We have this energy ecosystem that's made up of government agencies and associations and utilities, generators, producers, transmission lines, distributors. But I think you said something that I actually feel very strong on. And that energy ecosystem, we're very grateful here in North America because it's reliable, it's quite frankly cost effective. But I don't think they're built to move quickly. I think that's just not their model. And that's the reason. There's good reason for that. I believe you were conveying this, at least that's I picked up, is that the end user, the business, is going to have to drive this. And it's going to have to be driven for business reasons. And again, I want to relate to your podcast and information, because that most businesses aren't really well versed on energy issues. They kind of treat energy as a fixed overhead and don't think it's something controllable, but they're going to have to understand it's controllable because there'll be things that they can do. So where I want to go, and you conveyed this, is I think because the advent of AI, I think AI is a tool not only do we use here in our organization now, but I think it's a tool that's just in its infancy, that it will be used and can be used really effectively to help the market, specifically businesses, be much more proactive in not only managing energy and energy consumption, but also the opportunity for them to be prosumers, where they might be producing some of the energy, selling some of the energy. So I think AI is kind of that thought process. I'm curious to see where you think AI and if it fits into that equation on that piece. Besides the supply side, don't get me wrong, that supply side for the centralized grid will be really important. But where do you think AI will have its biggest impact, in the centralized grid or to the end user specifically?
I mean, I think both. But then the other aspect of things that you've not mentioned, and I'll come on to your points in a moment, but the other thing that's super important also is AI as is AI as load, as creating demand for power. And that's something which is a huge change.
Massive.
Again, that's really just emerged over the past couple of years or so. If you look at the recent history of power demand in the United States, it's basically been flat for most of the past 2 decades, 15 years plus. And now that's very clearly changing. And I think our forecast at Wood Mackenzie, I think we've got something like 2.3, 2.5% annual average growth in power demand out to the end of the decade, and quite possibly beyond in the US. And that's not only being driven by AI, there's various other things going on there. That's AI plus new manufacturing facilities, plus electrification of transport, plus some electrification of heating and so on as well. But data center is probably the single biggest line item in that. And so that's creating a whole load of new challenges and a whole load of new opportunities as well. It's obviously a lot easier to get investment to flow into an industry where demand is growing than an industry where demand is flat. And if you look at clean energy, if you look at renewables in particular, they are very often the lowest cost and most readily available source of electricity supply that you can get. Now, obviously, they have big problems for a data center, because a data center typically, not always the case, but generally needs to have power available 24/7. And you don't get that from wind. You don't get that from solar. You don't even get that from a combination of wind and solar. You probably don't even get that from a combination of wind and solar and storage. Although from those, put those 3 things together, you can probably get 75, 80, maybe 85% of the time you can get power supply from that. Then that means you're still either going to need backup generation, probably from gas, or you need to be connected to the grid or whatever. Point being that AI is going to be a big stimulus to investment in renewable energy just on the demand side. And as you say, to your point, it has to be about businesses, it has to be business decisions, because policy is going to be taking a step back. So that's going to be one thing, I think, which is going to be really important as a driver for investment in renewable energy over the next 5 years or so. And then, as you say, on the supply side, I mean, my answer, I think, would be all of the above, in the sense that it's going to be really important for the grid scale and also at the level of microgrids and demand response and a lot of things. And it's going to be really important for sort of integration of the two. And I don't know if you've discussed on the show much virtual power plants, but that's something we're now spending a lot of time researching. That's a technology we think is really exciting, growing to scale pretty rapidly, actually. Some of the big players in the virtual power plant world now have sort of 6-ish gigawatts of capacity that they can deploy. So that's a fair size generator if you've got that. There was a deal I saw just the other day, I think NRG and Renew Home, which is the Google spin out, they did a deal for a 1 gigawatt virtual power plant. So that's the same as building a 1,000 large-scale nuclear reactor. That really relies on AI, intelligent appliances, intelligent facilities, being able to coordinate large number of distributed resources in a very sophisticated way. And so that's something which, as you say, one clear application of AI to the industry that's going to make a big difference to energy. There will be a whole load more that we haven't even thought of yet. One of my favorite lines from The Simpsons is about alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. It's a bit like that with AI, right? AI is the cause of and also the solution to all the problems of the grid.
It's true. It's so true.
But it is. And I feel like we're just at the beginning of this journey. We don't really know still exactly what all of those applications are going to be. It's a bit like the early days of the World Wide Web in the mid-1990s, and people said, well, what is the point of this? People look at generative AI, chat GPT and things and say, well, it's just for kind of students doing their term papers and you can create a stupid meme image or whatever. In the mid-90s, people have said, well, the World Wide Web, this is just for kind of academics to send each other jokes and share research findings. How is that going to be important? And in a similar way, there are all those possibilities for the internet that we didn't see then. There are going to be a lot of possibilities for AI that we just can't see, sometimes can't even imagine at the moment.
I agree.
Well, I would love to come back on if you want to do that one. It would be, it is a fascinating topic.
As you continue to explore the evolving landscape of energy, what lessons from your career do you think are the most valuable for industry newcomers and seasoned professionals alike?
I think it's really important for people to get to, which I still wrestle with. And in fact, I think I talked about this the last time I was on your show, but it's true here as well. And it's, I think, good advice for everybody is striking the right balance between skepticism and enthusiasm, and managing to be both rigorous in your questioning of things and managing to have a reality-based view of the world at all times without becoming totally cynical and skeptical of everything and thinking that nothing can ever work and that no progress is ever possible. Because it's been shown, just as for example, if you think about the ways that many forecasters, official forecasters of the International Energy Agency, for instance, consistently underestimated the global growth of solar power, shale revolution in the US, a lot of people said, that industry. First, people said, the industry is not going to work. You'll never be able to produce gas. Then people said for a long time, that industry will never make money. It's always going to be loss-making. And I don't know if you remember, there was a whole sort of discourse in the financial community about that. Turns out that was completely untrue, that actually the industry is able to make money, has now been making, a lot of money, is generating a lot of free cash flow, paying off its debts, paying dividends, buying back shares, and is going to continue to do that for the foreseeable future. If you had listened to the naysayers at the wrong time, and I would say it's true of solar power as well, if you'd listened to the people say, well, it's impossible to come down the cost curve and so on, you would have missed these huge developments that are transforming the world of energy. And so being able to take that leap of faith, being, as I say, able to be both reality-based and appropriately critical, while also understanding that being reality-based means that you need to acknowledge the reality that there can be huge changes and that the world does change sometimes very rapidly. That, as I say, I think is the most important thing, is getting that balance right.
So what do you think, based on what you know now, and we all convey that there's so much that we don't know, even though we read and we learn as much as we can, but what would you say in 5 years' time, how is the energy world going to be different from what it is now? in North America?
So my expectation is that North America will increasingly in 5 years' time come to be seen as a bit of an island, which is resisting and rejecting a lot of the change that will be very rapid now in many other parts of the world. North America is blessed with fantastic advantages in terms of its natural resources. The oil and gas here on this continent are amazing, world scale. The industry is absolutely world class. The know-how and understanding the capabilities of the industry, the depth of knowledge is unmatched. And actually, another very important part of the story is the capital markets are unmatched, and the depth and strength of capital in North America is very, very hard to replicate anywhere else in the world. But I feel like those strengths can also be weaknesses. And that is the strength there ties you to a particular model of energy. And I think one of the things that's always really important for people to think about is energy. I think you talked about this earlier, but energy as an integrated system, that it's not just an oil industry or a pipeline industry or an auto industry. It's an integrated industry of the value chain that goes from exploration to production, to processing, to pipelines, to refineries, to fuel distribution, to fuel retail, to the vehicles that drive using that fuel, to the maintenance shops that look after the fuels that use that, to the maintenance shops that look after the vehicles that use that fuel, and so on. And in North America, all the links in that chain are very strong and well established, and they were established early in the 20th century and have been very robust ever since. In a lot of the rest of the world, those chains are not so strong, and change, therefore, is easier. And as you have new technologies that emerge that are cost-effective, other countries are going to move to those technologies. And so that's, I think, the thing you're going to see is EVs continuing to surge. In many parts of the world, you'll see solar power rising to dominate many markets around the world, probably with gas backup still as a viable part of the mix, but increasingly with storage providing that backup to solar. And I think that trajectory, that pace of change is going to be slower in North America. Probably the direction of travel actually is still going to be the same, but I think that we'll see kind of increasing divergence. So that would be my guess. As they say about forecasts, every forecast is wrong, but some are useful.
As an economist.
Exactly. And you might have been sitting here, if we'd been sitting having this conversation in, the year 2000, let's say, how much you would have got wrong about what happened to energy between 2000 and 2010.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I'm prepared to be proved wrong about this, and I would love to come back on and talk to you about it in 5 years' time, and we can see how much I got right and how much I got wrong. But
we'll recap this in 2029.
Exactly. We'd love to do that. As I look at the trends, that's going to be my expectation.
I actually don't disagree with you, but my opinion is, if that's the case, it might be fine for that time. But I think after that, 5 years will be a disadvantage in comparison to other countries around the world because we haven't taken that step. But we'll see what happens there too.
Yeah, no, I agree. I certainly think that's a risk. And definitely, I think that if I was a North American policymaker or strategist at any one of these companies, both on the oil side or the auto side, that's something I'd be thinking about very hard.
Ed, there were so many great insights from today's episode. To end off this episode, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think my biggest takeaway is that although it may look like the energy transition is kind of spinning its wheels and running into the mud, change is still happening. And although a lot of the commentary and the narrative around what's happening in energy, particularly in energy policy globally, is going to look difficult and challenging for low carbon energy, there are still a lot of trends progressing at a global level that are going to keep moving in the direction of lower carbon generally around the world. And I think that's essentially an eternal truth of this industry and this business, which is that we are going to see cycles, obviously, and there are going to be pendulum swings, and the pendulum swang one way in a big way up to about 2021, 22. Now it's swinging back the other way, and it'll do that for a while. But around that cyclicality, there is a direction of travel. There is one direction that we're heading in, and that is towards lower carbon. And I believe we're still on that course.
Great takeaway, Ed. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
Wow, there was so much we covered. How the policy set will have a huge impact in future generations. I would wish and hope that our policy decisions we do have to look in short term for sure, but I wish we had a real long-term perspective, because thinking of my children and their children, how this is going to be impactful. So the more knowledgeable people become, I think the more informed they'll be, the better the decisions they'll be able to make for themselves. And when that's done, then I think we'll probably go on that trajectory that we should be going on. But until that information is understood, I don't know if it may be status quo. That's kind of where I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, as you say, when you think about your children, your children's children, I was talking to a professional contact the other day who was talking about his daughter, and he was saying, when we have all these discussions about climate policy and everything, a lot of it is couched in the terms of, well, what do we want the global temperature to be in 2100? And that seems like unimaginably far off. And, I'm sadly not going to be around to see it. And I don't know if either of you, Lysandra or David, but I don't
probably won't make it that far.
No, but this guy I was talking to was saying, he was at his daughter's second birthday party. And in 2100, she's going to be 80-ish. So maybe even not yet 80, maybe I might be 78. That's, not that old. She's absolutely going to be alive then. She's absolutely going to be around to be affected by whatever happens. And so when you think about what the world you want to leave to your children and what your children are going to say about you after you've gone, and did you make the right decisions or not? That's a powerful perspective. I think that's a powerful way to think about it.
And if I could, Lysandra, because you come from a different generation than that perhaps Ed and I do, what's your takeaway from this session?
Yeah, I think honestly both sessions, Ed, have been great with you. I think what I find the most interesting is there's plenty of content, there's plenty of information out there. Just because there's information out there doesn't mean people are actually consuming it. And just because people are consuming it doesn't mean they're actually listening and understanding it. So we can sit here and we can create all this great content, but if people aren't understanding and seeing the value in it, I really think that's kind of where we need to get everyone on board, right? It's making sure people are consuming things and understanding why this is important. So I think that's often something that, you can't make people care. And it's really difficult because I think if we could, we'd all do that. So my biggest takeaway is getting our outside networks into these topics, getting them listening. And also what I really like, and something that we always discuss on this podcast, is the diversity of thought, and making sure the diversity of thought sticks with you, even as you learn more information, always being open to changing your perspective. What you know today may not be true tomorrow. And I think that you can always learn more. And if you find that you're in a situation where you're not learning more, you need to change the people that are around you or change the types of things that you're consuming. Something I find is when I get too comfortable, I'm a little scared. Because comfortability is very nice and we get used to comfortability. So I think it's always good to challenge yourself and change the way you think.
So Ed, Lysandra just threw down the gauntlet for the Energy Gang and that 360 on energy and carbon, that we got to get this out more and make sure people understand.
All right, Dave, Ed, thanks for another great episode.
Ed, it has been a pleasure, sir. And I encourage people to listen to your podcast. And look, I look forward to have you back again, because I got a feeling that we could have talked a lot more. But thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thanks a lot for having me on. Been great talking to you. Really enjoyed it.
Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
And you.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.